At a Thanksgiving dinner, Dad said, "Not everyone deserves a seat at this table." Everyone laughed and stared at me. I smiled and said, "Good thing I built a life that doesn't need your approval." Don't worry, your lesson in revenge will reach you soon. Have you ever been told, in no uncertain terms, that you don't belong? Not by a stranger, not by an enemy, but by the very people who were supposed to be your foundation. The ones whose love, you thought, was unconditional. This is Harper Jensen. And the first time I walked back into that Omaha house in almost 6 years, the scent of roasting turkey and furniture polish hit me like a physical blow. The cream-colored siding, the distant hum of a football game, it was all exactly the same. Inside, the dining room glowed with a forced, amber warmth, trying too hard to mimic family. My father, Robert, sat at the head of the table, his whiskey glass already half empty, his smile a predator's glint. He'd spent a lifetime fixing engines and people by tightening what he didn't understand. My mother, Sarah, fussed over the cranberry sauce, her movements a quiet denial of the tension thickening the air. My brother, Caleb, told some roaring story about his new truck, and everyone laughed. Everyone but me. Then, my father raised his glass, his voice booming over the clatter of forks. "Not everyone at this table deserves to be here," he declared. The laughter that followed was instant, too loud, too practiced. Every head swiveled toward me, the overeducated daughter who'd dared to leave. The one who made them all profoundly uncomfortable just by existing. I didn't flinch. I met his gaze, steady, unblinking. "Good thing," I said, my voice cutting through the suddenly thinning air, "I built a life that doesn't need your approval. Don't worry, you'll read about it soon." The room dropped into a silence so profound it felt like a physical absence. My mother froze, her fork midair. My father's grin flickered, just for a second. The old wall clock ticked, louder than it had any right to, marking the exact moment everything changed. I grew up in a house that smelled of motor oil and Sunday dinners, warm, noisy, and bound by unspoken rules. My father, Robert, believed the world was built by hands, not minds. He ran a small auto shop, fixing everything from pickups to lawnmowers, always in the same navy coveralls, like armor. To him, success was sweat on your forehead and grease under your nails. Books, computers, ideas. Those were for people who didn't know real work. When I was little, I'd sit on the concrete floor of that shop, swinging my legs, mesmerized. I loved the sparks, the smell of the machines, the way he could bring something broken back to life with a wrench and a curse. It felt like magic. But I also loved the sound of gears turning inside my own head. The curiosity that made me wonder why things worked, not just how. I wanted to trace circuits, understand the invisible patterns. He just called that overthinking. My mother, Sarah, floated through our days like a quiet melody. Gentle, patient, always smoothing tension before it could harden. Whenever Dad snapped, usually at me, for messing with junk again or forgetting my place, she'd murmur, "He means well, Harper. You know how he is." It became a lullaby of excuses, wrapping me up and shutting me down all at once. Then there was Caleb, my older brother. The golden child, quarterback, captain of everything. The one who made Dad's chest puff with pride at every Friday night game. His trophies filled a whole wall. The pride of the Jensens, everyone called him. Dad never corrected them. He didn't have to. The silence that followed said everything. Caleb was what I should have been. I wasn't jealous, not exactly. I just wanted to be seen for what I could do. While Caleb threw footballs in the backyard, I was digging through the junkyard behind our house, collecting old radios, broken speakers, discarded circuit boards. I'd spend hours in the garage after school, cross-legged, a screwdriver in one hand, a flashlight clamped between my teeth. I didn't have money for new parts, so I learned to make old ones sing again. When I repaired a busted transistor radio at 12, the signal fuzzed to life with an 80s song, and I nearly cried. That hum of static felt like the first sound of belonging. Dad didn't see it. He'd walk in, smell the solder, and grumble, "You're wasting electricity." When I tried to show him what I'd fixed, he'd shake his head. "That's not real work, Harper. You can't feed yourself with that." Then he'd ruffle Caleb's hair and say, "Now there's a kid who knows how to build something real." The first deep crack between us came when I was 15. I'd spent weeks building a small, wind-powered generator from scrap for the state science fair, soldering wires until my fingertips burned. When I won first place, the judges shook my hand, called me brilliant. I came home clutching the ribbon, my heart thundering. Dad was in his recliner, watching the news. He didn't look away. "That's nice," he said, "but don't brag about it, Harper. You'll make your brother feel bad." Something in me cracked, not loud enough for anyone else to hear, but deep enough to echo for years. I walked to my room, shut the door, and held that ribbon until it stopped meaning anything. That night, I realized love in our house came with conditions. It was something you earned by being the kind of person he understood, and I wasn't. After that, silence became our family language. We didn't yell. We just stopped talking. Dad stopped asking about my grades. I stopped telling him. Caleb's football trophies multiplied, golden figures frozen mid-victory, while my experiments stayed hidden under my bed. Mom still offered her soft, nervous smile, trying to hold everything together. "He's proud of you in his own way," she'd whisper when I helped her with dinner. "He just doesn't know how to say it." But pride shouldn't need translation. Love shouldn't sound like an apology. The older I got, the more I felt like a guest in my own home, a quiet shadow in a house where everything revolved around the men. I learned to disappear in conversations, to bite my tongue before asking too many questions, to turn curiosity into silence so it wouldn't be mistaken for defiance. But every night, when the house went still and the crickets took over, I'd sneak back into the garage with a flashlight and my pile of broken machines. There, under the low hum of the fluorescent bulb, I felt free. That garage became my sanctuary. The one place where my hands could move without judgment, where the sound of solder touching metal drowned out the words I'd stopped saying. I didn't understand it then, but every screw I tightened, every spark I coaxed back to life, was my way of building something my father could never take apart. The garage behind our house wasn't much, a concrete box with rusted shelves, a cracked window, and a single yellow bulb that flickered like it was deciding whether to keep trying. In winter, the cold bit through my sleeves. But that space, with its smell of motor oil and dust, felt more like home than any room inside the house ever did. The floor was always littered with screws, old radios, things no one cared about but me. It was chaos, but it was my chaos. I built my first circuit board there when I was 16. It wasn't perfect. But when I flipped the switch and saw a tiny red light flicker to life, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: control. For once, the world responded to me. I didn't have to ask for permission or approval. I could build something from nothing and make it listen. That yellow bulb became my sun. The hum of the power supply, my heartbeat. One night, rummaging through old tools, I found my grandfather's pocket watch. The glass was cracked, the minute hand frozen at 12:47. Dad used to call it junk from another time. But when I held it, I felt its weight, like it carried a story still trying to move. I took it to my workbench, pried open the case, and stared at the delicate gears inside, so small, so precise, so stubborn. I spent hours hunched over it with tweezers and a magnifying glass, refusing to give up. By dawn, when I finally adjusted the last spring, the second hand trembled, then began to tick. A soft, steady rhythm, fragile but alive. I remember laughing quietly, the sound echoing in the cold air. That broken watch, forgotten in a drawer, was beating again. It was the first thing I ever brought fully back to life. I wore it on a chain around my neck for weeks. Every tick reminded me that I could make something move forward, even when everything around me stood still. That was the night I made myself a promise. Sitting on the cold concrete floor, the watch in my palm, I whispered, "If I can't make them proud, I'll make time itself listen." The words came out small, almost like a prayer. The next day, Dad walked past the garage and saw me working. He shook his head. "Still playing with your toys, Harper," he said. I wanted to tell him I'd fixed something he'd thrown away, made it tick again. But I didn't. I just smiled faintly and said, "Yeah, just playing." Because I knew he wouldn't hear it anyway. He didn't speak the language of quiet miracles. After that, the garage became my world. Every night after dinner, I'd sneak out with a thermos of cocoa and work under that yellow light until I couldn't feel my fingers. The air would buzz faintly from the old power outlet. I filled a notebook with sketches of inventions, tiny engines, robotic arms, sensors that could move on their own. None of them looked like much, but to me, they were proof I could dream without permission. Each page was another rebellion against smallness. Sometimes, when the wind was strong, I could hear the faint sound of the high school stadium across town, the crowd cheering for Caleb's team. It used to make me feel invisible. But as the watch ticked in my pocket and my soldering iron glowed, I realized I didn't need to be in that stadium to matter. My victories were smaller, quieter, but they were mine. One night, I stood at the garage door, looking out at the frozen yard, the lights from the house flickering behind the curtains. Everyone inside was laughing, probably about Caleb's latest touchdown. Maybe about me. I smiled anyway, a little sad, a little proud. Then I whispered to the dark, "One day I'll build something that moves the world, even if they never see it." The words didn't echo, but they didn't need to. The garage heard me. The machines heard me. And so did time. The watch in my palm ticked on, slow and steady, like it agreed. The letter came on a Tuesday afternoon, tucked between bills and a hardware store catalog. I almost missed it. Thin, white, stamped with the blue seal of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I didn't open it right away. My hands were shaking too hard. For a moment, I just stood in the kitchen, staring, hearing the faint tick of my grandfather's pocket watch in my jacket pocket, a heartbeat reminding me to breathe. When I finally tore it open, the words blurred. "We are pleased to inform you that you have been awarded a partial scholarship to MIT." I read it again and again, whispering the words just to be sure they were real. A partial scholarship. I had done it. I ran outside to the garage, letter in hand, like it was proof of something I'd been trying to say my entire life. Dad was out front, leaning against his truck, oil on his hands, the radio humming old country songs. "Dad," I said, breathless. "I got into MIT, on a full scholarship." He didn't even look up at first. "MIT," he repeated, wiping his hands on a rag. "That's for people with money and no sense." "It's a full ride," I said quickly. "They're covering tuition, all of it. I'll work for housing. I'll figure it out. It's a chance. My chance." He laughed once, low and sharp. "A chance for what? To waste 4 years pretending you're better than the people who raised you." My throat tightened. "It's not about that. It's about what I can build, what I can learn. This is what I've worked for." He tossed the rag onto the truck's hood. "You think I care about those toys you build in the garage? That's not real work, Harper. That's daydreaming. MIT doesn't make people like us. It eats them alive." I felt something heavy slide down inside me, like a door closing. "I can handle it," I said quietly. "I've handled everything else." For a second, he just stared at me, like he was trying to see the child he used to understand, but couldn't find her anymore. Then he said, almost softly, "You go. You're on your own. You want to chase this fantasy? Fine. But don't expect this family to pick up the pieces when it falls apart." The setting sun hit the windows behind him, turning everything gold except his eyes. They were hard, unblinking. I wanted to believe he didn't mean it, that he was just scared for me in his own way. But deep down, I knew this was final. Mom was standing by the doorway, her hands clutching a dish towel, knuckles white. She didn't say anything, just watched us, her face pale with something between fear and heartbreak. When I turned to her, she gave me that small, tremulous smile I'd known my whole life. "He doesn't mean it, Harper," she said. "You know how he gets." I nodded, because it was easier than telling her that this time, he did mean it. That night, I packed quietly. Just 2 suitcases, a stack of notebooks, and the pocket watch. I couldn't sleep, so I sat at my desk, staring at the letter under the lamp. The words, "Congratulations," and "We look forward to your contributions," glowed faintly. I thought about the garage, about the small red light on my first circuit board, about the night I whispered I'd make time itself listen. Maybe this was time's answer. In the early morning, I heard the creak of the floorboards. Mom moving softly down the hallway. She knocked on my door, then opened it halfway. Her eyes were red. She held out a paper bag. "Sandwiches," she said, her voice shaking, "for the bus. And an apple. You'll need to eat." I took it, trying to smile. "Thanks, Mom." She hesitated, then stepped forward and hugged me. It was quick, almost clumsy, but warm. When she pulled away, she whispered, "You have your grandfather's hands. You know, he would have been proud." Then she left before I could answer. When I stepped outside, the morning was cold enough to sting. The bus stop was 2 blocks down. I dragged my suitcase through the frost, the wheels bumping over the cracks. The neighborhood was still asleep. As the bus rounded the corner, I looked back at our house. The windows were dark, except for one, the kitchen, where Mom stood behind the curtain, a shadow in the soft glow of the stove light. I raised my hand, even though I knew she couldn't see me clearly. Dad's truck was still in the driveway. He didn't come out. When the bus doors hissed open, I climbed aboard, sat by the window, and pressed my forehead against the glass. The pocket watch ticked softly in my coat pocket, each beat steady and sure. For a long time, I watched our street fade into the gray horizon. I didn't cry. There was something freeing in the silence of that bus, in the way the world opened wide and endless beyond Nebraska's flat roads. I didn't know what waited for me in Boston, just that it was mine. As the bus picked up speed, I took the watch out. "We're going," I whispered. "Let's make it count." Outside, the frost sparkled like metal. The highway stretched ahead, long and bright, carrying me toward a place where I wouldn't need anyone's permission to exist. Cambridge was nothing like Omaha. The city moved faster, spoke louder, and never stopped glowing. Even the air felt smarter, charged with ambition. I rented a room in a crumbling 3-story house, barely wide enough for a twin bed and a folding desk. But it had a single window overlooking the street, and from there, I could see the faint red glow of the MIT dome. It felt close enough to touch, like a promise I had finally caught. The scholarship covered tuition, but not living expenses. So, I took whatever jobs I could find, washing dishes before sunrise, cleaning labs at night, running on coffee and pure, unadulterated luck. I kept the pocket watch in my coat pocket at all times. When I was too tired to think, I'd slip my hand inside, feel the slow rhythm of its ticking, and remind myself why I was here. If I can't make them proud, I'll make time itself listen. Days blurred together, lectures in the morning, problem sets in the afternoon, work until midnight. Some nights I'd stay in the robotics lab until dawn, curled up on the floor beside half-assembled prototypes, the hum of machines lulling me into a shallow sleep. My body was constantly tired, my brain constantly alive. I built small robotic arms from scrap, programmed microcontrollers on borrowed laptops, and dreamed of machines that could move like living things, precise, silent, and kind. MIT was full of brilliance and arrogance in equal measure. My classmates came from families of scientists and CEOs. They spoke about innovation like it was their birthright. I stayed quiet most of the time, absorbing everything. I didn't have pedigree. I had hunger. I didn't have funding. I had the stubbornness of someone who'd burned every bridge behind her. By my second semester, the exhaustion began to show. I skipped meals without meaning to, choosing lab hours over food. My hands trembled from too much caffeine and not enough sleep. One night, around 3 a.m., soldering a circuit, my vision blurred. The iron slipped. The world tilted. The next thing I knew, I was on the cold floor, metal clattering away. When I opened my eyes, I was in the campus infirmary, and N4 dripping beside the bed. A woman with auburn hair and a messy bun was scrolling through a tablet next to me. When she noticed I was awake, she smiled. "So, you do have a pulse," she said. "That's good news." I blinked, groggy. "Who are you?" "Chloe," she said, offering her hand. "You scared half the lab last night. I found you on the floor, surrounded by wires and something that looked like a dying toaster. You really know how to make an impression." I managed a weak laugh. "It's supposed to be a delivery unit." "Well," she said, it almost delivered you to the afterlife. From that day on, Chloe became my anchor. She was everything I wasn't: loud, fearless, unfiltered. She came from Seattle, studied biomedical engineering, and somehow always found time to cook. "You can't run on vending machine granola bars," she'd scold, showing up with soup in a plastic container. "Brains need fuel, Harper, relax." I didn't realize how lonely I'd been until Chloe started showing up. She didn't ask about my family, and I never volunteered the story. We didn't need to. We spoke in blueprints and equations, in long nights at the lab and quiet cups of coffee at the all-night diner down the street. She called me the machine whisperer. I called her the storm. Together, we built, and broke, and built again. I started carrying the pocket watch in my backpack, right next to my notebook. Its ticking filled the silence when I worked alone. Sometimes, when I was too tired to think, I'd take it out, set it beside my laptop, and time my progress to its rhythm. It reminded me that precision could coexist with persistence, that you didn't have to rush to move forward. The years crawled and sprinted all at once. Between coursework and jobs, I found myself drawn to one problem: how to make robots that could actually help people, not just fascinate engineers. Hospitals used expensive systems, but small clinics, especially in towns like the one my mother worked in, couldn't afford them. I remembered her coming home from nursing shifts with sore feet and a tired smile, saying, "We're short-staffed again." That memory never left me. So I started sketching a compact transport robot that could navigate narrow hospital corridors, avoid people, and deliver supplies, fast, cheap, reliable. It wouldn't be pretty, but it would matter. The kind of invention that could make real lives easier. Chloe caught me hunched over the sketches one night. "You're building something," she said. "I can tell by the look on your face." "Not yet," I said, tracing a line on the blueprint. "But I will. I want to make something that matters, something that moves the world." She teased, echoing the words I hadn't said aloud in years. I smiled faintly. "Yeah, something like that." We spent countless nights working in the lab. When we couldn't afford parts, we borrowed from broken prototypes. When we ran out of time, we skipped sleep. Every time the robot failed, we rebuilt it, laughing through frustration. Chloe had a way of making the impossible seem temporary. One night, after a long test run finally succeeded, we sat on the floor eating cold noodles from the container. The robot rolled past us, humming quietly, carrying a tray from one end of the room to the other. "You realize," she said, "you just built the thing you used to dream about." I watched it move, slow but steady, and felt something rise in my chest. Something that felt like pride, but softer. "Not yet," I said. "This is just the start." I didn't tell her I was already imagining where it could go, into small-town hospitals, rural clinics, places forgotten by progress. Places like where my mother still worked, her hands cracked from winter, her heart too big for the world she lived in. I wanted to send her something that would ease that weight, even if she never knew it came from me. By the time I graduated, I had more than a degree. I had a prototype, a dream, and a single truth carved into my bones: survival wasn't about escaping the past. It was about transforming it. The day before commencement, I sat by the Charles River with Chloe, watching the sunset reflect off the water. The pocket watch ticked softly in my hand. Chloe nudged my shoulder. "So, what's next for you, Jensen?" I looked toward the horizon, where the city lights were beginning to shimmer, and said, "I think it's time to build something that doesn't need anyone's permission to exist." The wind off the water was cold, but I didn't feel it. For the first time, I wasn't running from home anymore. I was running towards something entirely my own. After graduation, Boston no longer felt big enough. The city had given me everything I needed to become who I was, but it also reminded me too much of survival, of cold nights and fluorescent lights and ramen dinners that tasted like determination. Chloe felt it too. One night, over coffee in a quiet diner, she said, "What if we stop building other people's dreams and start building ours?" That's how Northline Robotics was born. A name chosen at 2 a.m., when the world felt endless and possible. We packed our few belongings into her old hatchback, strapped the prototypes into the back seat with duct tape, and drove west until the skyline gave way to mountains. We chose Denver not because it was convenient, but because it was wild. It had open skies, sharp air, and room to breathe, something Boston never had. We found an old auto garage on the edge of the city and rented it for next to nothing. The space was drafty, its walls lined with rusted tools and peeling paint. It smelled faintly of gasoline and rain-soaked concrete. But to us, it was perfect, a blank canvas. We scrubbed it clean, set up folding tables, strung extension cords, and claimed it as home. The early days were brutal. Winters in Denver could cut through your bones, and the heater barely worked. We wore gloves while coding, our breath fogging in front of us. Dinner was always the same, canned soup, reheated noodles, or the occasional pizza when we landed a freelance gig to keep the lights on. Nights blurred together, code turning into numbers, numbers turning into hours, hours turning into years. We built everything by hand, frames, sensors, circuitry. Chloe handled design. I handled mechanics and algorithms. Our first prototype, Northline 1, was small, clunky, and constantly breaking. Its navigation was shaky, its sensors unreliable. But it had a pulse. We stayed up entire nights rewriting code and soldering joints until our fingers went numb. Every time we thought we were close, something failed spectacularly. Motors overheating. Software loops freezing. Batteries dying in smoke. Money ran out faster than courage. Investors smiled politely, but passed. They didn't understand why two women with no corporate backing thought they could compete with billion-dollar robotics firms. Too niche, they said. Rural healthcare doesn't scale. They were right about one thing, it didn't scale easily. But that wasn't the point. It wasn't about markets or profits. It was about meaning. I wanted to build something that mattered to people who were never seen. By the second year, our accounts were nearly empty. We owed back rent on the garage. Our equipment was failing. Even Chloe, eternally optimistic, started to lose her light. One night, she slammed her laptop shut. Maybe they're right, Harper. Maybe no one's waiting for this. I didn't answer. I just stared at the old pocket watch on the workbench beside me. It was still ticking, steady and patient, like it always had. I thought of my father's voice, MIT is for people with money and no sense. Then I thought of my mother's tired hands, her hospital shifts, her quiet strength. I looked at Chloe. Someone is waiting, I said. They just don't know it yet. The next morning, I wired every last dollar from my personal savings into the company account. Chloe didn't find out until later. You put in everything? She asked, freezing. Everything you had. I nodded. If we're going down, I'd rather do it building something real. She stared at me for a long time, then exhaled. Okay, she said, then let's make it count. A month later, a hospital in rural Montana reached out. Their administrator, Dr. Chopra, had read a small blog post about our prototype and wanted to test it. We can't afford the big commercial systems, she said over the phone. But we'll take anything that works. Chloe and I packed up Northline 1, wrapped it in blankets, and loaded it into a rented van. The drive took 16 hours through snow-covered plains and mountain passes. By the time we arrived, the sky was lavender with dawn. The hospital was small, 2 floors, 20 rooms, a handful of nurses who looked more tired than paid. We spent 3 days setting up sensors and mapping the hallways. The staff watched us curiously, but didn't expect much. When the first trial run began, I held my breath. The robot whirred softly, rolled down the hall, turned at the first corner, and for once, didn't crash. It carried a tray of lab samples from the nurses' station to the diagnostics wing without a single error. The nurses clapped, half in disbelief. By the end of the week, Northline 1 had completed over 200 deliveries. Supply turnaround times dropped, costs plummeted, and nurses who once spent hours running errands now had time to sit with patients. Dr. Chopra called us into her office on the final day. You didn't just save us money, she said. You gave us time. On the drive back to Denver, neither Chloe nor I said much. The snow came down in slow sheets, catching in the headlights. Halfway through Wyoming, she looked at me. We did it, didn't we? I smiled faintly, my eyes still on the road. Barely, I said, but barely counts. The next morning, a local Montana newspaper ran a small story titled, "Engineer Builds Robots for Rural Healthcare." It wasn't a national headline. It wasn't front-page news. But it was something. The first time I saw my name in print, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt still, like a clock that had finally found its rhythm. The article spread quietly, first among medical forums, then local tech circles, then small-town hospitals desperate for affordable solutions. Emails began to arrive, slowly at first, then dozens at a time. Can we test your model? Can we license your design? Can you teach us how it works? Within 6 months, we had more orders than we could handle. Chloe cried when the first real check cleared. I didn't cry. I just stood in the middle of our cold garage, the robot humming softly beside me, and whispered, "They don't see me, but the world will." And it did. By the end of the year, Northline Robotics had expanded into a proper workspace. The walls were clean now, the lights bright, the floors warm. But I kept that old pocket watch on the shelf above my desk, still ticking away the hours. It reminded me that I hadn't escaped my past. I had transformed it into motion. Every tick was a small defiance against every voice that said I couldn't. Sometimes at night, when the lab went quiet and Chloe had gone home, I'd sit alone and listen to that sound, the faint, steady heartbeat of everything I'd built from the wreckage of what I'd left behind. And every time it clicked, I heard the same promise I made years ago in the cold of my father's garage: if I can't make them proud, I'll make time itself listen. Now, it was listening. So was the world. 3 years later, the world finally caught up to what we'd built. Northline Robotics had grown from a cold garage into a real company, 30 employees, multiple hospital contracts, and a clean, glass office downtown with our name etched on the door. I'd learned how to speak the language of investors. How to stay awake through 18-hour days. How to smile for cameras even when I hadn't slept in 2. Chloe called it success. I called it survival with better lighting. When the email came from Forbes, I almost didn't open it. The subject line read, "Congratulations, you've been selected for the 30 under 30 in healthcare." I stared at it for a long time before clicking, half expecting it to be a mistake. It wasn't. They wanted to feature our work on robotic systems for rural hospitals. The same dream that had started in a freezing Denver garage, now printed in a glossy magazine that used to sit untouched on my father's coffee table. The ceremony was held in San Francisco. All marble floors and glass chandeliers. Cameras flashed, champagne flowed, and people introduced themselves with smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. I wore a simple navy suit and a silver watch. The pocket watch was too old for nights like this, but I kept it in my purse anyway. It ticked faintly, grounding me. During the live interview, under the blinding stage lights, the reporter leaned forward and smiled. "Harper Jensen," she said brightly. "Your company has helped hospitals across 5 states. That must feel incredible. Tell me, your family must be so proud, right?" The question hit harder than I expected. It wasn't cruel. It was casual, innocent even. But it landed exactly where it hurt. The studio lights blurred for a second. I smiled, because that's what you do when you can't afford honesty. "They're probably busy," I said lightly. "We don't talk much about work." The interviewer laughed politely, moved on. The cameras kept rolling. I answered everything perfectly, measured, articulate, unshakable. But inside, I could feel something small and familiar hollowing out a space in my chest. That night, I returned to my hotel room, overlooking the bay. The city below glowed like circuitry. I kicked off my heels, set the award plaque on the desk, and sat by the window with a glass of champagne I never drank. For a while, I just watched the fog roll in from the water, trying to let the noise of the evening fade. Out of habit, I reached for my phone. I scrolled through emails first, congratulations from partners, messages from colleagues, a text from Chloe that simply said, "We did it." Then, without meaning to, I opened Instagram. The first photo that appeared stopped me cold. My father's account, one I hadn't looked at in years. The picture was simple, our old dining room in Omaha. My father, mother, and brother Caleb sitting around the table. Same amber lighting. Same walls. Same china plates. Caleb was laughing, his arm slung around Dad's shoulder. Mom's smile was small but warm. The caption read, "So proud of my boys." There was no empty chair in the picture. No hint that I'd ever existed at that table. I stared at it until the screen blurred. The sound of the city outside grew distant, like I was underwater. I set the phone face down and let the silence fill the room. The champagne on the nightstand caught the light from the window, tiny bubbles rising in slow, lazy motion, untouched. I leaned back against the cool glass and closed my eyes. This was supposed to be the moment that made everything worth it. The recognition, the validation, the proof. But instead, it felt hollow, like a pause in an empty room. I had built everything I'd promised myself I would. Everything they said I couldn't. And yet, the people I'd once wanted most to see me had never even looked up. I reached for my purse and took out the pocket watch. It was still ticking, steady and unbothered. For years, that sound had meant hope, momentum, progress, defiance. Tonight, it just sounded like time passing, indifferent to what I had built or lost. I set it on the nightstand beside the champagne. The faint reflection of the city lights glinted across its surface. Outside, the fog thickened, swallowing the skyline until only the faint glow of streetlights remained. I whispered into the empty room, "They don't see me, but the world will." My new apartment sat high above downtown Denver, its walls made almost entirely of glass. From where I stood, the Rockies stretched across the horizon like a memory that refused to fade. The morning light spilled in softly, catching on the clean lines of the furniture, the pale oak floors, the quiet hum of a city waking below. For the first time in years, I didn't hear machines, alarms, or footsteps. Just air, just silence. When I moved in, I promised myself I wouldn't fill the space with noise. No clutter, no chaos, no ghosts. The walls were bare except for 3 frames, my MIT diploma, the first Northline robotics blueprint, and a photo of the prototype that saved that Montana hospital. Between them, hung the pocket watch encased in glass. It still ticked, its rhythm soft and steady, a reminder not of struggle anymore, but of arrival. The centerpiece of the apartment wasn't the view or the decor. It was the table. I'd commissioned it from a local craftsman who salvaged wood from abandoned barns. 12 feet long, reclaimed walnut, with 12 identical chairs. No head, no end. Everyone equal. When it was delivered, the craftsman asked if I wanted to stain it darker. I told him, no, let it keep its scars. It's the only honest thing in here. That table became the heart of my home. Not for show, not for meetings or media interviews, but for something quiet, solitude without loneliness. Some nights I'd make a simple meal, soup and bread, and eat in the soft glow of the pendant light above it. Other nights I'd spread out sketches for new prototypes, tracing ideas across its worn surface until dawn. There was a peace in that routine, a rhythm I had never known in the house I grew up in. I used to think success would sound like applause or recognition, but here it sounded like the faint tick of the pocket watch and the whisper of wind against the glass. It was the kind of quiet you don't earn by running faster. It's the kind you reach when you finally stop. Sometimes I caught myself staring at that table for long stretches, imagining what it would feel like to have it full. People talking, laughing, no one trying to prove their worth, no one sitting lower or higher than anyone else. Maybe that was the real dream all along. Not robots or headlines or companies, but a seat at a table where everyone belonged. There were no family photos anywhere, not out of bitterness, but out of truth. They didn't belong here. This space wasn't built on nostalgia. It was built on reclamation. I had spent too many years trying to make something out of absence. Too many nights wanting someone else's approval to make me whole. Now, the absence was part of the design. Every inch of quiet, every empty chair, was exactly where it should be. When guests visited, colleagues, new friends, the occasional journalist, they always commented on the view. "It must feel amazing to live up here," one of them said once. I smiled and replied, "It feels quiet. That's enough." At night, Denver glittered below like a field of stars fallen to earth. I'd turn off the lights, let the city's glow fill the room, and listen to the watch ticking softly on the wall. For years, that sound had been a measure of survival, counting the seconds between exhaustion and hope. Now, it was the sound of stillness. Of time that didn't need to be outrun. Sometimes, when I caught the reflection of the mountains in the glass, I'd think about that old dining room in Omaha, the rigid table, my father's voice, the laughter that cut sharper than words. The contrast was almost surreal. There, I had learned to stay small. Here, I had learned to take up space without apology. I didn't build luxury. I built peace. And for the first time, it was enough. The message arrived on a gray Tuesday morning. The kind of day when Denver felt more like sky than city. 6 p.m. Thursday. Mom misses you. Just that. No emojis. No pretense of small talk. 7 words that landed heavier than they should have. I must have read it a dozen times, the cursor blinking on the screen like a heartbeat. It had been years since I'd gone back to Nebraska. Years since I'd stepped inside that house with its amber light and walls that could hold a grudge. I'd promised myself I wouldn't return unless I wanted to. And I wasn't sure if this counted as wanting. But, Mom misses you, was enough. It always had been. So Thursday morning, I packed a small bag, grabbed my coat, and started driving east. The miles blurred by, slow stretches of highway and empty plains, the mountains fading behind me like a memory I wasn't ready to let go of. The pocket watch sat on the dashboard, its steady tick filling the silence between radio and wind. By the time I reached Omaha, dusk had settled, washing everything in a pale orange that made even the ordinary look forgiving. Their house looked smaller now, like someone had pressed time down on it. The shutters still green, the porch light still flickering. For a moment, I just sat in the car, engine running, hands gripping the steering wheel. Then I turned it off, pocketed the watch, and walked to the door. Mom opened it before I could knock. "Harper," she said softly, the same voice that used to wake me for school. Her smile trembled, caught between guilt and relief. "You made it." "I did." I tried to smile back. The warmth hit me first. The smell of turkey, cinnamon, and something faintly metallic, like memory. The dining room was just as I remembered. Too much light, too little space to breathe. My father sat at the head of the table. Same spot, same posture, older but unchanged. His hair had thinned, his shoulders stooped slightly, but his presence still filled the room like static. He looked up, a flicker of surprise on his face before he masked it with a tight smile. "Well," he said. "Didn't think you'd actually come." "I almost didn't," I said, matching his tone. Caleb was there, too, sitting beside his wife, a broad grin on his face. "Harper, you wouldn't believe it. We just finished remodeling the house. Built it ourselves. 4 bedrooms, garage big enough for both cars. Dad says it's the pride of the Jensens." Of course he did. I smiled politely. Letting him talk. He filled the air with stories about Little League and mortgage rates. The safe kind of talk that kept everything else buried. I nodded in the right places. Laughed when I was supposed to. Mom busied herself at the counter, her movements careful, as if one wrong sound might shatter the fragile peace. The conversation stayed light for most of dinner, but it was the kind of light that flickers before it burns out. Every word was layered with the things none of us were saying. My father asked about my machine company, in the same tone someone might ask about a hobby. My mother asked if I was eating enough. Caleb offered to set me up with one of his friends who liked smart women. It was after the second bottle of wine that the air changed. My father leaned back in his chair, swirling the glass. His cheeks were flushed, his eyes gleaming with the kind of nostalgia that usually precedes cruelty. He raised his glass, his voice booming like old times. "You know," he said, "not everyone at this table deserves to be here." The words hung there for a beat, heavy and familiar. Then the laughter came, soft at first, then louder, rolling across the table like the echo of another lifetime. Caleb laughed because that's what he'd always done. His wife joined in. Even Mom gave a nervous, automatic smile, the kind that meant, "Please, let's not make this worse." All eyes turned to me. The clock on the wall ticked once. I set down my wine glass carefully, deliberately, as if the act itself mattered. I looked at him, not angry, not wounded, just clear. Good thing I built a life that doesn't need your approval, I said. My voice was calm, steady, unshakable. Don't worry, you'll read about it soon. The laughter stopped instantly. The room went still, like someone had pulled the air out of it. My mother froze with her napkin in hand, eyes flicking between us. Caleb cleared his throat, muttered something about dessert, but no one moved. My father's face hardened. He didn't speak, but his grip on the glass tightened until his knuckles went white. I stood slowly, my chair scraping against the hardwood. Thanks for dinner, Mom, I said softly. The food was good. She opened her mouth to say something, an apology, maybe, but nothing came out. I walked toward the door, the sound of my heels echoing through the silence. At the threshold, I turned once, just enough to see them frozen around the table. My brother looking down, my mother still clutching the napkin, my father's fork suspended midair, his mouth half open like a man about to defend something he no longer believed. Outside, the night was crisp and cold. The porch light flickered once, twice. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the quiet. The kind of quiet that used to hurt, but now felt like freedom. Then I walked to my car, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. Through the rearview mirror, I saw the house shrink behind me, its windows glowing soft against the dark. Somewhere inside, dinner would resume. The laughter would return. The same lines repeated, the same comfort built on silence. But not for me. For the first time, I wasn't leaving in anger. I was leaving because I finally understood. I didn't need to earn my place at that table. I had already built my own. A month later, the snow had settled over Denver like a soft, white hush. The city lights shimmered beneath it, quiet and reverent, as though even the streets understood what time of year it was. I hadn't planned to do anything for Christmas. For years, the season had meant empty rooms, unanswered calls, and a calendar full of work to fill the silence. But this year felt different. Maybe it was the dinner in Omaha, the look on my mother's face, or maybe it was the realization that some wounds only stop bleeding when you stop waiting for someone else to heal them. Whatever it was, one morning in early December, I called Chloe. What if, I said, we host a dinner? She laughed. A company dinner? No, I said, something real. Something for people who never get invited to the fancy ones. 2 weeks later, the conference hall at Northline's headquarters was transformed. We cleared out the machinery, brought in long wooden tables, strung golden fairy lights from the rafters, and filled the air with the scent of cinnamon and roasted apples. We hired local chefs, rented buses to bring in hospital staff and families who couldn't afford the trip, and filled the space with a warmth no amount of money could fake. The guest list wasn't curated or elegant. It was human. Nurses from rural hospitals, patients recovering from long-term illnesses, a handful of single parents juggling medical bills, and a dozen children still fighting their way back from hospital beds. No media, no sponsors, just people who deserved a night where the world felt kind again. When the doors opened that evening, the cold rushed in with laughter. Children ran toward the tables decorated with pine cones and silver ribbons. The nurses, still in their scrubs, shyly accepted mugs of cider. Music floated through the air, soft jazz, just enough to make the room feel alive, but never loud enough to drown out conversation. I moved between the tables quietly, checking that everyone had what they needed. Chloe had dressed up as Mrs. Claus, handing out wrapped scarves and gloves. A local bakery had donated gingerbread cookies shaped like gears, her idea, not mine, and they disappeared almost instantly. Halfway through dinner, one of the older nurses, a woman named Brenda, caught my hand. You didn't have to do this, she said, her eyes glistening. I know, I said softly. That's why it matters. The food was simple but perfect. Laughter grew louder as the night went on, weaving through the music and the clinking of cutlery. It was the sound of belonging, raw and unpolished. I was pouring cider for one of the kids when I noticed a man with a camera at the door. Then 2 more local reporters, drawn by word of mouth. I hadn't invited them, but I didn't send them away either. Some stories don't need hiding. One of them, a young woman with a notepad and an earnest smile, approached gently. "Miss Jensen," she said. "We heard you organized this whole thing yourself. Would you mind telling us why?" I looked around the room, at the nurses laughing with their patients, at the children tearing open presents wrapped in bright red paper, at Chloe pretending to be shocked every time someone thanked her. Then I smiled. "Because everyone deserves a seat at a table," I said. "Especially those who are told they don't." She nodded slowly. "That's beautiful." I shrugged. "It's just the truth." She left soon after, but not before her photographer snapped a few pictures of me sitting beside one of the children, a little girl in a wool hat too big for her head, her foreport tucked beneath her sleeve. Her name was Mia. She was 8 years old and recovering from leukemia. She told me she wanted to be an engineer someday. "Like Iron Man," she whispered, grinning through missing teeth. We talked for nearly an hour. She asked endless questions about the robots. I showed her sketches on my phone, and she drew her own version on a napkin, a lopsided little machine with a smiley face on its screen. When I told her it was perfect, she giggled, that bright, clear sound only children seem to carry. Later, when the night was winding down, she looked up at me with wide, serious eyes and asked, "Do you have a family?" The question landed softly, but deep. For a moment, I didn't know how to answer. The truth was complicated, heavy. But she wasn't asking for a confession, just honesty. So, I smiled and said, "Tonight, I do." She nodded, as if that made perfect sense. When the last guests left, and the music faded, the room was a beautiful kind of chaos. I stood there for a long moment, taking it all in. The laughter still echoed faintly in my ears, a sound so full it almost hurt. Chloe came up beside me, her cheeks flushed, her hair escaping from the Santa hat. "You realize this is going to be all over the news tomorrow," she said. "Let them write what they want," I said, smiling. "It's not about that." But the next morning, the photo was everywhere, on local news sites and healthcare journals, even shared on social media by hospital workers across the country. It showed me sitting with Mia, both of us laughing over her napkin drawing. The headline read, "Engineer hosts Christmas dinner for patients and nurses, says everyone deserves a seat at the table." My inbox filled. My phone buzzed. But what I remembered most wasn't the noise. It was the feeling. The warmth of that room, the smell of cinnamon, the laughter that didn't come at my expense. That night, I walked into my apartment, the golden city lights glimmering against the snow, and set the pocket watch on the table. It ticked softly, filling the space like a heartbeat. For years, that sound had marked time passing without meaning. Now, it sounded like grace. And for the first time, I realized something simple, something I'd spent years chasing without knowing why. I didn't need to be proud of where I came from. I just needed to be at peace with where I'd arrived. The next morning, the world outside was still blanketed in snow, soft and bright under the Denver Sunday. The apartment was quiet, except for the faint hum of the heater and the steady ticking of the pocket watch. I was making coffee when my phone began to ring. The number was familiar but unexpected, home. For a second, I almost didn't answer. Then I did. "Harper." My mother's voice was small, breathless, like she'd been holding it in for years. "It's everywhere. The news, the papers, your photo, the dinner, the little girl. Your father saw it first thing this morning. He didn't say anything. He just left the paper open on the table." I closed my eyes and leaned against the counter, the warmth of the mug grounding me. "It's okay, Mom," I said quietly. "I didn't need you to see that I'm good. I just wanted you to know I'm okay." She was silent for a moment. Then I heard the sound of her crying softly on the other end, the way she used to when she thought no one was listening. "He was wrong," she whispered. And I was too. I told myself staying quiet would keep the peace, but silence never protected anyone. I see that now. I swallowed the ache in my throat, staring out the window where snow still drifted down like ash. "I know, Mom," I said gently. "You don't have to explain." "I should have stood up for you," she said, her voice breaking. "I should have told him to stop, that you didn't need to be like him or your brother to make us proud. I thought I was keeping the family together, but all I did was lose you." The words hit harder than I expected. Not because they were harsh, but because they were honest. The kind of honesty that comes too late and still matters anyway. "You didn't lose me," I said softly. "I just had to go build something else before I could come back." She laughed through her tears. A shaky, fragile sound. "Your father," she paused, searching for the words. He didn't say anything, but when he read the article headline, "She built a table for those who had none," he just sat there for a long time. Then he folded the paper and walked out to the porch. I pictured it instantly. The old kitchen, bathed in morning light. The newspaper spread across the wooden table. The same table where those words had once been spoken. "Not everyone at this table deserves to be here." And now, years later, another table, another story printed for the world to see. "Maybe he's thinking," I said. "That's a start." "Do you think he'll call?" she asked. I smiled faintly. "I don't need him to." She was quiet again. The kind of quiet that felt like a breath after a storm. "It's Christmas soon," she said finally. "If you want, you don't have to, but..." "Mom," I interrupted gently. "Every Christmas gives us another chance to start again. Maybe this one's yours." I heard her inhale sharply, then exhale in relief, like a weight she'd been carrying had finally slipped off her shoulders. "I love you, Harper." "I know," I said, and meant it. "I love you, too." When the call ended, I stood there for a long time, the phone still in my hand. The apartment wrapped in the hush that follows forgiveness. Outside, the snow had stopped falling, and sunlight streamed through the window, scattering across the long wooden table. On it sat the folded newspaper, the Denver Post, its front page still visible. "Engineer builds a table for those who had none." Beside it lay the pocket watch, its face reflecting the light, its steady tick echoing softly through the room. I sat down, running my fingers along the worn wood grain of the table, tracing its imperfections. Every mark told a story: the late nights, the loneliness, the building and rebuilding of a life that no longer needed permission to exist. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel angry or small or unseen, just peaceful, whole. In the quiet, the watch kept ticking, unbothered by the world's noise. Its rhythm filled the space like a heartbeat, patient and alive. I smiled to myself, looking out over the snowy Denver skyline, the mountains standing tall in the distance, strong, steady, and forgiving. Time, I thought, doesn't heal by erasing. It heals by keeping rhythm until you're ready to dance again. And as the city shimmered below, I whispered into the stillness, "Merry Christmas, Mom." The watch ticked once more. Steady. Sure. The sound of life moving forward. One beat at a time. If anyone ever told you that you don't belong at their table, what did you do? Did you fight for your seat, or did you do what I did and just build your own? Let me know in the comments below, because sometimes, you realize the best revenge is simply living a life that proves them wrong.